Hi, thanks for joining us. This is Richard Petty from the Trinity College Oxford Access and Outreach team. I work particularly in schools, in state schools in the northeast of England. And here with me for this Trinity Beyond the Classroom session 8 talk is Anna Chrysostomides. Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, it's really nice to meet anyone who's watching. I'm Anna Chrysostomides. I am a lecturer at Trinity. I do tend to work mostly in the Faculty of Theology and Religion. And I also, my full-time job is actually at Queen Mary University of London, where I teach in the School of History. So if you have any questions about that also, you are very welcome to get in touch with me. Very easy to find me online with that surname. Yeah, that's about it. You're going to hear about my research in a minute anyway, so. Shall we carry on with the actual lecture then?
Please do.
All right, so let's see if I can find it. Here we go. Let's see if it's working. Oh, it's asking for permission. That's really exciting. Good. Actually, do you know what? It might be easier if you share my screen since you share the presentation.
No problem.
Okay, since you already have it, because this isn't on the app, so it's going to be weird.
Okay, and I shall just go to the correct screen.
Yeah.
We have this beautiful presentation that Anna's put together. Look at that. Right. I'll shut up now and over to you, Anna. Can you take control there or shall I move through for you?
It's not going to let me do it.
Okay, shall move through. Just be really bossy with me and just tell me to move on when you're ready.
Okay. Yeah, I will do. Okay, right. So basically, we're going to be talking a little bit today about female conversion to Islam in the medieval Middle East. Mostly, I'm discussing people with a background in Eastern Christianity, but not everyone. I'm going to look at two women in particular who have some really interesting stories, and hopefully we'll be able to give you a new insight into what medieval Near Eastern women were like generally as well. Can we go to the next slide, please, Richard? I'm sorry. Right, so there's going to be, I'm actually just going to do 2 sections. I was going to do 3, but people seem to prefer watching the recording for this particular talk. So I'm going to skip the path to academia. And if anyone has any actual questions about that, they can feel free to email me. And Richard will probably ask a couple anyway, just to be representational of students. So we're going to start talking a little bit about who were the Abbasids, because the 2 women that I'm going to focus on in this lecture, their stories were written down during the Abbasid period in Islamic history. And that is about 200 years after their lifetime. So we're going to be looking at why their stories were written down then and why they were written in the way they were written. And in the second section, we're going to talk about the stories themselves and really focus in on these women. And you might learn something that you never heard about before. Okay, let's start on who were the Abbasids. So, one more click. This is our timeline. You'll notice that on the left, you've got the emergence of Islam, and we're sort of marching through time over to the right side of your screen. So Islam begins in around 1060 CE. This is when Muhammad, the prophet within Islam, receives his first revelation from the divine. After his passing in 632, we have the start of what's called the Rashidun Caliphate. This is the very first Islamic caliphate. And there are 4 they're known as rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidun caliphs, and they really start the precedents rolling for all of Islamic society that emerges after this point. That is when most of the conquests out of the Arabian Peninsula happen and Islam spreads throughout the known world at the time in the Near East. So it spreads all the way from Al-Andalus out to probably present-day Pakistan. After that, you have the Umayyad Caliphate, which also reaches out quite far. They're the ones who really get the edges of Al-Andalus and present-day Pakistan. And then we move into the Abbasid Caliphate. And there are a few details that we need to know about them in order to understand the content. Women's lives were written during this time period. So if we could please go to the next slide. The Abbasid Caliphate is from around 750 to 945 CE. It has 2 different capitals. one in Baghdad, which is in Iraq, and one in Samarra, which is a bit further east. In Samarra, there's a new mix of people in government positions and elite society. So you have more use of Turkish slave soldiers, as well as other types of domestic slaves from all the borderlands around the Islamic world. Every civilization in the medieval world has something that's kind of like slavery. This is totally common, but Turkish slave soldiers had a tendency to choose who would be the next caliph after a little while. So it's important to know that you have a new sort of ethnicity and culture that comes in and starts to take a little bit of control. You also have a shift from mainly Arab leaders to mainly Persian, or a mix of Persian and Arab and Turkish leaders. So this type of ethnic shift is an important aspect of the Abbasid Caliphate. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, there is a massive translation movement. Baghdad becomes the intellectual center of the Middle East. They imported and created their own knowledge, and they did a lot of this by translating texts from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, Syriac, and Hebrew. And you name the intellectual pursuit, and it was translated from one of these languages. Astronomy, astrology, maths, medicine, poetry, theology, philosophy, all of it got translated at this point in time. Some of you may have studied things like Aristotle and Plato a little bit for A-levels or for GCSEs or something like that. Sometimes these ancient Greek philosophical works that we have now, where it's actually preserved through the Arabic as opposed to always being in the area of Greece or in the Mediterranean basin. So a lot of the knowledge that we have about the ancient world actually comes through this Arabic translation movement in Baghdad. Now, importantly, during this time, there were some ethnic tensions, and this was between a concept of Arab superiority that's inherited from the Umayyads, which was the empire that came before, as well as Persian, Greek, Indian, and Turkish cultures. So there's this tension between whether Arabs were the real Muslims, were the actual pinnacle of society in the Abbasid Caliphate, or whether Islam could be for everyone, and people from any kind of ethnicity could actually rule the community. The questions that were being asked were new converts even capable of being true Muslims in the same way as Arabs? Is that possible? Can you be a real Muslim without being an Arab? Muhammad was an Arab. The Quran is written in Arabic. This leads to something called the Shabiya movement, which is actually a really amazing movement. You have basically poetic rap battles between different groups, mostly Persians and Arabs, where they kind of insult each other with these rap battles. So it can be pretty funny. So the insults are definitely not PC. They are not things that you would want to say today, but you can read them and look at how they're sort of creatively insulting each other. And this model actually also gets plastered onto different types of ethnic discourses. For example, the author Al-Jahiz writes a work called The Superiority of the Blacks to the Whites, and he includes some really interesting rap battles where people of different racial appearance actually are insulting each other based on that. So this gets sort of used in lots of different ways, this style, this poetic rap battle way of like working out tensions within society. So this is the backdrop. This is the Abbasid Caliphate. We have ethnic tensions. We have new types of ethnicities ruling the community. We have a different outlook and different capital cities than ever before in the Islamic world, and we have a massive translation movement that really valorizes intellectual activity. Okay, so next. So now we're going to move on to actually talking about our stories about ladies who converted to Islam. So we're going to focus on two, and they are not the tame little madams that you might expect. These guys are powerful. Yeah, we can do a quick jump to next slide. So I just want to remind you that on the right-hand side, 750 to 945 CE, we have the Abbasid Caliphate. So I don't think you can see my mouse, unfortunately. So just look at that and think about the fact that these are authors writing in this time period about women who lived at the very other end of the screen between the emergence of Islam and the Rashidun Caliphate. Right? So that's a really big gap between when these women lived and when their lives are being written down. Now, these narratives were preserved in oral tradition in the meantime. So oral cultures are very good at preserving narratives. It's something that academics have a tendency to disagree about. So there are camps of academics who say, well, oral traditions are exceptionally good at memorizing things, all of the material that's presented from an oral tradition and written down later is something that's actually completely accurate and we can trust it. There are other academics who say things like, well, really, it's written down, it could change over time. People with different interests might pick out different things without the intention of changing the story, but because of their own perceptions, they may accidentally change the story when they pass it on, or things that are more relevant a few generations later might mean that people emphasize different aspects of the story, and so it may change as time goes on. And then, of course, there's like a camp in the middle. There's sort of a whole spectrum of thoughts about what these oral traditions are, how we can actually use them as historians, in terms of doing religious history. So you can decide what you think about that. I'm just going to tell you about these narratives and allow you to make your own conclusions. Now that you have the background of the Abbasid Caliphate, you know that they were oral narratives for the majority of this timeline that you can see on your screen until the Abbasid Caliphate, and that's when they get written down. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to start with al-Fadl. So she was the wife of al-Abbas, who is Muhammad's uncle. He's the person that the Abbasid Caliphate was named after. He's the person that the rulers of this massive empire claim descent from. Right. So she is one of the very first converts to Islam, possibly even earlier than her husband. And we can talk about that a little bit later. There are several accounts that actually question when al-Abbas converts to Islam. But that is, a conversation for a different time because we're going to focus on her today. So it's quite likely that she converts before her husband. She was known as a strong woman. She remained behind in Mecca with her husband when he may or may not have converted. Again, it's a complicated story. And as a result, she ends up in a situation where she's protecting a disabled man from someone attacking him. However, quickly, I want to explain why it's important that she remains behind in Mecca for those of you who don't understand the shift, the movement from Mecca to Medina. So can we quickly go to the next slide and I'll explain this a bit. Okay, so you can see farther south, you have a city. There aren't cities on this map, but that red arrow is pointing to where Mecca is. Mecca is currently where the Kaaba is, where Muslims go on Hajj for pilgrimage. It's an incredibly sacred space for Islam. Mecca is where the early community initially was established by Muhammad. Eventually, they have to move. They have to go to Medina because of persecution in Mecca. And also, Muhammad was invited there. At the time, it was called Yathrib, in order to help some tribes in that area come to terms with each other, because there was a lot of conflict there, and he was known as an incredible mediator and a very trustworthy person, even before he became a prophet. So he was asked to help out in that community. Later, it gets called Medina al-Nabi, which is the city of the prophet. Medina just means city in Arabic, and it becomes the center of the early Islamic community. It is the first city that is under Muslim rule. It is the first moment where that community gathers in a political sense. So this movement from Mecca to Medina is when the Islamic calendar starts. It's called the Hijra. And the fact that al-Fadl stays behind with al-Abbas is very significant because it means that at that moment, al-Abbas, for whatever reason, was not willing to make this journey with Muhammad, which would very clearly show his loyalty to the new community. So he doesn't do that. He's still there in Mecca, and she stays with him. Okay, can we go down to the next slide? So this is the reason she's behind. So she's in Mecca because of that, because he stays behind. And she ends up defending someone else who is disabled, who had to stay behind because he couldn't move with the Hijra. After a battle occurs, she defends a disabled man who used to make arrows instead of fight for the cause. His name was Abu Rafi. And Abu Rafi was a client of Muhammad. We can explain what clientage is later. That's a whole different conversation. But Abu Rafi tells the following story in a really important chronicle of Islamic history. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is Abu Rafi's story. This is entirely just quotation marks. I skipped the middle bit because it's quite long. So Abu Rafi says, "By God, I was sitting there smoothing arrows, and al-Fadl was sitting there with me, both of us overjoyed by the news that we had received, because Muhammad wins at the Battle of Badr. So they're in the middle of Mecca in Quraysh territory, which is the tribal confederation that Muhammad basically rebels against with his new religion and his move to Medina. And they're currently kind of at war. They have a battle. Muhammad wins this battle. So Abu Rafi and al-Fadl are celebrating this. When evildoer Abu Lahab approached, so he's someone who's on the Quraysh side, he's someone who's defending the traditions of Mecca. So he approaches dragging his feet in malice. He sat down by the guy rope of the enclosure of the tent so that his back was to my back, to Abu Rafi. Him and Abu Rafi are sitting back to back. While sitting there, Abu Rafi says something about the angels being on the side of Muhammad to al-Fadl. And Abu Lahab raised his hand and gave me a violent blow on the face, says Abu Rafi. I rushed at him, but he picked me up and threw me to the ground and then knelt on me and beat me, for I was a weak man. Again, this person was disabled. We don't know how, but he wasn't capable of normal mobility. al-Fadl went to one of the tent poles of the enclosure, picked it up, and gave Abu Lahab a blow on the head. A blow which splits his scalp open and made an unpleasant wound. She then said, "You treat him arrogantly when his master is absent," meaning Muhammad, he was his client. He got up and turned away, humiliated. By God, he only lived for 7 days before God afflicted him with pustules from which he died. So al-Fadl, strong lady, defends a disabled guy by beating up a bully with a tent pole, basically. This is the type of woman whose conversion narrative was important, whose conversion narrative was one that was passed on through generations, orally before being written down. And when it was written down like this. You have a conversion narrative of her being one of the first women to convert to Islam, one of the first people to convert to Islam, probably even before her husband, who is, the progenitor of the Abbasid Caliphate under which this is written. This is an important person in Islamic history. So I will let you decide what you want to decide about why this was written in the way it was written. But this is something that you will see crop up time and time again in medieval Islamic history or the history of the medieval Near East in general. A lot of the things that you might think because of present day media or simply just looking at European descriptions of life in the medieval period, you might not expect some things like this. So let's look at our next lady. I think she's the next slide. Yes, so, okay, now let's have a look at Hakim bint al-Harith ibn Hisham. So Hakim's life is recounted in the Muwatta, Sirah, Tabakat of Ibn Sa'd, and al-Tabari's history, so it's recounted all over the place. This woman's narrative is plastered everywhere. She converts to Islam before her husband. Sound familiar? We have another example of this. Her husband, who did not want to convert and join the side of Muhammad during some of these conflicts that I've just explained, her husband tries to run away. He goes to Yemen and he tries to take a boat over to what is now the area of Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti. Then it was called the Oxumite Empire. He tries to flee to Eastern Africa, basically. And she goes to Yemen, finds him right before he gets on the ship, drags him back to Muhammad, puts him in front of Muhammad, and then he gives up and just accepts Islam at that point. So she is the reason that he actually converts. Her conversion comes first, and she completely coerces him into converting with her. Her strength of conviction isn't entirely surprising, considering some other narratives that we have about her life, again, plastered all over all of these texts that you see at the top of the slide. So let's look at the next slide, please. So Hakim happens to be one of the Qurayshi women who fought with swords, and this is very specific because women don't tend to fight with swords. Usually, as you saw before, they're like hitting people with tent poles, things like that. But she fought with a sword at the Battle of Yarmouk, which is a really important battle. It's when Syria is taken by the conquest, by the Arabs in the army from the Byzantine Empire. This massive empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that's been there forever, not forever, but for several hundred years, is defeated at the Battle of Yarmouk. And she was one of the soldiers fighting with swords at that battle. Her first husband dies there, which is sad. But in another important battle, Marj al-Sufar, in 634, she single-handedly killed 7 Byzantine soldiers, this time with a tent pole, not with a sword. But this was while she was basically on her honeymoon. She was a newlywed in her second marriage, so possibly why she was more around the tents than, right in battle with a sword. But yeah, so we're talking about a woman who was able to participate in 2 battles, 2 victorious battles, and she handles herself quite well in both of them, though it's hard to know if she actually killed 7 soldiers. Numbers in historical sources tend to just symbolize more than you would expect or a lot. But who knows? Maybe the people who are firmly staunch believers in the oral traditions are right, and she did kill 7 Byzantine soldiers with a tent pole. Totally possible. Right, so these are 2 ladies that are just everywhere in medieval Islamic literature. They are not everywhere in quite the same sense that the male companions to Muhammad were, but in terms of women, they're incredibly prominent. As you can see, they turn up in lots of different texts. They turn up in some of the most important chronicles, biographical dictionaries, and hadith compilations of the time. If you don't know what those are, you can always email to ask, or if Richard wants to ask, I'll explain them after. But these are important text types. These are things that everyone who was educated would have had access to and would have been reading. So these also would have been oral narratives that would have been passed on from one generation to the next, which is why they got written down in the first place. And I'll again let you make your own decisions about why people in the Abbasid Caliphate decided to write these stories down in this way. All right. I think that's all I've actually got lecture-wise anyway, so we can end here and do whatever we need to do from here.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was absolutely fascinating. Some amazing stories there that seem amazing for any age, but particularly the age that you've been discussing. So just to take us back, we are often asked when we go around schools, some people think Oxford University, for example, is a lot less old, or actually in some cases sometimes even older than it actually is. And we tend to say that it's the oldest university, oldest university in the English-speaking world. And I usually sort of follow that up by saying that sounds a bit smug, doesn't it? And, very self-satisfied. I'm fascinated by particularly the spread of education in the Middle East. So it's my understanding that there was more than one university, for example, in Baghdad in the 7th century. Is that correct?
It was organized in a slightly different way. So you do have universities in the Near East long before you have them in the UK, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
For your Oxford talks.
Yeah.
But yeah, they definitely predate the ones here. The ones that are set up in Baghdad they're not quite universities in the way you would think of it today. They're more discussion circles, informal seminars that surround specific teachers that would be present at a mosque or masjid. For those of you who aren't Muslim, mosque is basically the word that people who aren't Muslim use to talk about something that's a masjid. So it's where people go to pray. It's just the English word of that. There's a long etymology that I don't know, but I'm sure it's very significant. But yeah, so the teachers would just sort of hang out in social spaces, in the masjid, and they would have people who would come and be with them. And some would help support them financially, others wouldn't. Education was something that does get institutionalized for the elite, but it also was accessible even if you were not elite for many. It depended on personal connections, on knowing that it was even a thing.
Well, that was my lead-in next question, really. I mean, you mentioned, the educated people having access to this. If it can be as crude as to suggest a sort of vague percentage, what sort of proportion of people in society would have access to some form of education?
I'm not sure I can put a percentage on that. I'm not sure we have enough information to have a percentage on that. But what we can see is that people who were you can tell that people were enslaved and moved from families that were enslaved generationally, or even not generationally. Like, there are people who are enslaved that are really well educated. So you can even see that amongst the lowest classes, they can rise to the caliphal court quite easily. And we know this because of biographical dictionary. So what a biographical dictionary is it takes a famous scholar or poet or a significant personage of one kind or another. They sort of change what they do as you go through time. And they talk about their past and their family and who their parents were and their parents and where they were from. And they also talk about the person's life and how reliable they are in terms of like passing on these oral traditions that I was talking about. And so you can see from some of these entries that people come from really low class backgrounds and can rocket up to being in the caliphal court, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, it does. It does make sense. I'm just going to jump a bit in theme now, but it's something that's come throughout the presentation. To what extent has it been important for you? Firstly, do you speak Arabic?
I can read Arabic. I can read classical Arabic very well. I sound like a 6-year-old Dora the Explorer when I try to speak Tunisian Arabic, which is the dialects that I know.
Wow, right. I guess I asked that question. I didn't actually know what the answer was, so I'm pleased you do read Arabic, because it might have been a bit of a bad question if you didn't. But you know, how useful is that? I guess that's more or less critical to your work, is it?
It's absolutely essential,
Yeah.
being able to read
Yeah.
it. And being able to read, it's a very specific type of Arabic. So it's not like I just took a standard Arabic class. Like, I had to actually learn classical Arabic, which is harder than modern standard Arabic, because languages tend to get easier as you go along in time.
So go on.
Oh, there's just really specific vocabulary sets that you need to know, and grammatical constructions that exist in this like really highbrow legal literature and like historical literature that don't necessarily happen in everyday speech now.
So does that mean if you did speak some of these words, you might come across, say you could speak it, you might come across to a modern Arabic speaker as coming from like sort of, you know, a different century?
Oh yeah, I sound like Chaucer, or maybe like
Right.
6-year-old Chaucer / Dora the Explorer, because if I don't know a word in a dialect, I'll pull from the medieval, and it sounds very strange to a modern Arabic speaker.
In the reverse direction, I have a friend who, an acquaintance who is a mother tongue Russian speaker, but essentially stopped speaking Russian when she was 7, just because she left the country and so on. And so when she now talks Russian, she basically, much of her vocabulary is based on, you know, what 7-year-olds talk about. I guess dinosaurs or something, you know, rather than things that, you know, yeah.
Yeah, it's really funny the vocabulary that you end up having.
So the language, I mean, obviously it's an essential tool really for your profession, really, isn't it? But and I guess from what you're saying, you learned specific bits of the language for the tools that you need. So in other words, it was driven by profession rather than you learned the language, of course, and then got into what you were studying.
Well, I did that with some of the other languages I know. So because I do Christian-Muslim relations and conversion, I also have to know medieval Greek and Syriac.
Wow. Okay, this is getting really interesting. So, like, come on, don't be modest. Hit us with it. What are the languages?
I can read 5, which is pretty common for people who do what I do, actually. So, 2 of them are just modern languages for secondary source purposes, French and German. If anyone wants to go to graduate school and do anything like history or religious studies, start your French and German now, because they're really useful, because you want to know what academics in those countries are talking about. But in terms of like ancient languages, I started learning like Koine and ancient Greek first, just as part of my undergraduate degree, because I have Cypriot heritage and I was really curious about, you know, the history of the language and all that stuff. So I started doing that first, and then started getting the interest in Islam and Christian-Muslim relations and all of that.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I mean, do I infer, I think you might have just started to say it at one point as well, do I infer that once you've started to learn a language, in your case French and German, when you were, you know, much younger, it becomes easier to accumulate others?
Yeah, it does. And if you're from a bilingual household, it's even easier.
Okay, yeah. I think it's lovely to hear a walking, talking advert for the study of languages as well, because we're always trying to say, and it's not just about learning the language; it's all the skills you acquire, of course, in learning the language.
Absolutely.
So much crucial part of language learning. Just a third strand of question then, if I may ask, Anna, just a little bit about your background. We've already got this sense that you've obviously you've been learning the languages to advance your art. How did you come to being interested in this particular world? Because it's very specific, isn't it?
Yeah. So I suppose I've been interested in questions of Christian-Muslim relations and the early origin of interactions between Christianity and Islam for a very long time, from really, childhood, teenage years. I was kind of curious about it. Never knew it would be my profession, but I was very curious about it. And this is partially because I come from a background of being half Cypriot, and my stepmom is, and her entire family, who I grew up with from a very young age, they were refugees in the 70s from Famagusta in northern Cyprus. So they went and lived in Limassol for a little while, and then they moved to the US sort of in dribs and drabs. My grandparents, step-grandparents, I guess, but they're like my real grandparents, came over when I was a teenager. And I remember them doing their citizenship tests, and my grandfather never learned English. Well, he knew it, but he was always too afraid to speak it. So it was, yeah, I grew up with a family who felt very close to a lot of Shia Muslims. So I had a couple sort of Iranian aunties that my stepmom was very close to. And she can speak Persian because she lived with them when she was at uni in the US. And but anyone who is a Sunni Muslim, or especially if anyone was Turkish, my family would immediately clam up and be a little, not super pleased. And they would tell stories, about their life as refugees, or losing their home. These narratives were very common, and it was always associated with Sunni Islam and Turkish people in particular. So obviously I was very curious about this, and then when I was a teenager, 9/11 happened, and so then America got obsessed with Islam, and I had I had Muslim friends that I was close with, and I felt like I had more in common with them culturally than I did with a lot of my other sort of more Protestant American friends at the time. So it's a very long story of like finding heritage and commonalities and a lot of background stuff from family. But yeah, so it's a big backstory, that one.
That's an amazing story. Well, there were also, am I hearing there were also people, I guess, who were also emigres from Iran as well, I guess, in
Yeah,
terms of the timing.
yeah. So my stepmom's friends at uni had also left Iran, and they mostly spoke Persian, but now they're all very Americanized, even her. But yeah.
And so when you went to study, you initially were studying French and German, but what was your major history?
No, so in my undergraduate, I did undergraduate in the US, and so I had a double major. I did English literature and linguistics on the one hand, and also religious studies on the other.
Well,
So yeah,
we should just explain, shouldn't we, that a major in the liberal arts style of an American degree is essentially American universities typically have a broader based study and then a particular focus on one or two areas. Is that a fair summary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty much how it works.
Okay, so you looked at those two areas, and then what about the transition to graduate study, and and then a DPhil in due course? What?
So one thing that US universities have in common with UK ones is that you often write an undergraduate dissertation. And during the process of doing that, I had toyed around with lots of ideas, and one of the ideas I had toyed around with was comparing Sufism and Al-Ghazali, who's a very famous Sunni Muslim Sufi, with forms of mystic Christianity, and it was like too big of a topic to do as an undergraduate dissertation, so I decided, okay, I'm just going to look at things like this in a master's and see where that goes. And so then I went on and did a master's at Temple University in the US. yeah, so one of the reasons for learning German actually was because I kind of figured out that I wanted to be an academic when I was probably my second year of uni. And so I decided that I really needed to like work on getting German because I already had French. So I did German and ancient Greek then. And so like had a path laid out. I knew I needed to learn Arabic at some point. I knew I needed to learn Syriac at some point, but I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen when, but I knew that in my undergraduate career, I needed to pick up those two languages. So I did it at that point. And I should say that I did have a bit of a leg up in that my American mom is a historian. So she did help me with like understanding, like she is an academic and she helped me understand like how to apply to graduate school. Whereas my Cypriot family was a little bit more like, why don't you just become a school teacher and get married and have babies? And wouldn't that be great? Which is a great thing to do, but was not what I wanted to do. So there's some interesting push and pull during that process as well.
And then a DPhil at Oxford.
Yeah, I did an MPhil and a DPhil at Oxford because I wanted to follow the American system in case I went back. But then I accidentally married an English guy. So, you know, that happens.
So you're also at DPhil. We should probably also say that DPhil is a doctorate. It is a doctorate, isn't it? And of course you use the title doctor. Just because some of our students that we work with think that doctors are just medics.
Oh no, yeah, no, you are called a doctor when you when you do lots and lots and lots and lots of uni and writing things down.
And then effectively that's led into your current interest since, really. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all come together. I've spent some time, a fair amount of time in the Middle East working on Arabic. At one point there was like I've had to spend a couple summers there. If you want to learn a language really well, you need to go to the country in which they speak the language to really get it. Even if you're learning a classical form, it just helps to hear it.
Just go and live there and absorb. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One final question, if you don't mind, Anna. Just bearing in mind that people coming across this will probably be, I suppose, centered around the age of, say, let's say probably year 12. Meaning 16 to 17. They might be thinking about higher education. They might be thinking about all sorts of options at this stage, possibly in subjects that they don't currently learn, because obviously a lot of the things that people apply for, they're not currently doing A-levels or BTECs in them, that they're working out whether they're interested. Is there anything in your particular field that you would say, you would love to have come across it when you were 16 or 17 as a kind of super curricular resource, a book or a particular sort of lecture series or something like that that's quite accessible?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much out there. There's some great lectures on YouTube. There's actually great like little cartoony history renditions on YouTube that you can watch to give you a general overview of different aspects of Islamic history. But
what are they called?
Oh my gosh, you can just literally type them in. I don't remember any specific names. But I do it all the time because sometimes I'll tell my Queen Mary classes, like, watch this YouTube video just to get a gist. There's some really good versions of Layla and Majnun, this like beautiful romantic story in Persian. Anyway, but there's also some work that I wish I had read. And I'm just going to give a list of authors' names because I can't, like, they just have so much that's out there. But anything by Aisha Gessinger, Layla Ahmad, Yossi Rappaport, Patricia Crona, like these people are really influential and have written some really amazing stuff about women within Islam, about Christian-Muslim relations, about the development of early Islam, that it would have been lovely to have come across earlier. And particularly Aisha Gessinger, Layla Ahmad, and Yossi Rappaport are very easy to read. Their writing style is like just really nice. It's warm and fuzzy. So they're good people to check out.
I'll easily be able to search those online. One particular emphasis that we place on supercurricular engagement, as we call it, particularly, for example, for higher education applications, which might involve an admissions test or an interview, is always trying to emphasize, don't feel that you need to know everything. It's not turning up to an interview and being tested on your knowledge. It's just really thinking through things that you're really interested in. So whatever they may be, however niche they may be, if you think you're going down a really specific rabbit hole, for me, that's probably a good thing. And
Yeah.
yeah, rather than a bad thing, always sort of saying, rather than feeling whatever your subject is, or your potential subject at university, don't feel like you need to know all about that subject. Feel like you've explored 3 or 4 parts of that subject really deeply,
Yeah,
rather
absolutely.
than being an expert in everything, because you can't be. You can't be once you've done an undergraduate degree, let alone, when you're younger and you're keeping other A levels going and things at the same time.
Definitely. It's about a curiosity and a willingness to think and engage with whatever material you're looking at in any application for any university.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Anna, for joining us this afternoon and doing this recording. Really appreciate it, and you've really conveyed your immense enthusiasm for this, a very different world, but also in some ways interestingly similar as well. Some aspects of what you've discussed this evening. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I hope anyone who watches this enjoys it.
Thanks very much. We'll say cheerio.